Black History Month, the Milton Public Library, Friends of the Milton Public Library, and the Milton Historical Society would like to welcome all of you tonight. We are pleased to welcome tonight's speaker, Diane Rapaport. Diane is a former trial lawyer. She has made a new career as a historical consultant, genealogist, and award-winning author. Last year we had her speak on her book, The Naked Quaker, and she does have copies of that available after. She specializes in New England court records, and her current research focuses on the struggle achievements of forgotten African Americans and Native Americans who lived among the New England colonists. In her research, Diane has even found a Milton story that she will share in her presentation tonight, entitled The Many Faces of Early Colonial Slavery, True Stories from New England. Let's all welcome Diane Rapaport. Thank you.
Thank you for coming out during a lull between snowstorms and fighting the traffic. I was on the road for 2 hours, but I made it in time. So anyway, as you heard, and some of you, I look familiar from last year. I think you probably heard that I wrote a book, The Naked Quaker, and that has true stories from colonial New England. And I give a lot of talks all over New England. Often about my Naked Quaker book, and you know, those have quirky and amusing stories about colonial New England. I usually get laughs, but this is a presentation of a different sort tonight. The stories that I'll tell you tonight probably aren't going to make you laugh. Some of them are sad, some of them are inspiring, and all of these people, slaves from colonial New England, are people who deserve to be remembered, but could very easily have been totally lost to history if it weren't for some of the colonial records that remain to tell about them. And this is a more appropriate place than you might realize to tell stories about colonial slavery, because slaves lived in Milton in the 17th and 18th centuries. For example, there probably were some here before this, but in 1691, a Milton man named Enoch Badcock, it might have been Babcock, the spelling was variable in those days, but he purchased Jack, who was described in the records as a Negro man, and he paid 29 pounds for him. Just a minute, I want to get my laser because I want to point out some things when we get to some documents. And when Badcock died 4 years after that, he had 2 slaves in his inventory, his probate inventory. And Peter Thatcher, the first minister of Milton, also had slaves. You know, lots of people did back then. He owned an Indian woman and a slave from Jamaica, and then he had at least 3 other slaves who were born into slavery in his house. The Milton Church, in fact, set aside a special part of the church for where the slaves and the people of color could sit, the hindmost seats of the uppermost gallery, not the best part of the church. And as the numbers increased, and by 1754, there were apparently at least 19 African American slaves, probably more because these figures are for slaves 16 years and older. And the numbers increased further. By 1765, there were, according to histories, there were 47 Negroes and mulattoes, and some of them may have been free. We don't know for sure. But rather than impersonal statistics like these, I like to know their names. And we do know some of the names of Milton slaves, in addition to the Jack, who was purchased in 1691, because these names show up in probate records, church records, town records, land records, and you know, I think their names should be known. We should name them again. Sapio and Della, they were John Taylor's slaves here in Milton, and they married about 1733. About the same year, a slave boy named Primus lived here, owned by John Wadsworth. Robin has appeared in the records, and he was owned by Samuel Miller, is about 1741. Sambo and Dinah, they married in 1750, but they were owned by different masters, so they may not have been able to live together. A boy named Caesar, Richard Clark of Milton, Milton papermaker, owned half of him, according to the records. I don't know who owned the other half. And Pompey was a slave owned by John Newton and probably others. When Newton died, he provided for Pompey in his will. I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. And I'll also tell you tonight more about, and I don't know if it's the same Pompey or Pompey, I'm not sure how they pronounced it back then, but about him and his wife. Records that I found at the Massachusetts archives that tell some surprising things about, gives us more insight about what was going on back then. And that is really one practically untapped resource for finding out more about colonial slavery. It's people who otherwise would really be lost to history, and that's colonial court records. They're still mostly unpublished, hidden away in archives or on microfilm, and very much overlooked by a lot of the historians that are working in this time period. But court records are my specialty. As you heard, I'm a former trial lawyer, and I started digging into colonial court records years ago and discovered they were a treasure trove of information that just wasn't out there in history books. And so I've spent a lot of years doing detective work in these records. Some more examples of what they look like. And I found many more stories in them about slaves than I'm going to have time to tell you tonight, and more than I've had time to write about and have published. But tonight I'll tell you a few highlights. And I know there are many more stories out there for researchers who are patient and persistent enough to dig into them, because I keep running across new things all the time. So let me give you a preview of what I thought I'd cover this evening. I thought I'd give, this isn't going to be a history lecture per se. I'm more interested in the stories about these people, but I did want to give you a little bit of background about early colonial slavery in New England, and also more about who was enslaved, and because it was not just Africans or people of color, and the distinctions between slaves and servants were blurred, especially in the 1600s. So I'll tell you a little bit more about that, which I think you need to understand if you do look in these old records. And then a few true stories. I've been researching court records all over New England, but tonight I thought I would just focus on a few stories from Massachusetts and Connecticut, which had not only a lot of slaves in the 17th and 18th centuries, but also have remarkably well-preserved court records. For example, I'll tell you a bit about two African-American brothers. They were unusual. They had a last name, Warro, and they were born in America on a Maryland plantation about 1640, and they came to New England as slaves of a prominent Puritan. And then I've also found more about one of the son of one of those brothers, and he tried to help his half-sister escape from slavery in Medford, and I've found records about that, and I'll tell you a little bit more about what happened to him and to his father and uncle. And then a black Milton man of Pompey, may or may not have been the same man as the one John Newton had owned, but he petitioned the governor and the General Court of Massachusetts for justice for his Native American wife. And a free black farmer from the New London, Connecticut area I'll tell you about him, John Jackson, and his wife Joan. He struggled for years in and out of court to rescue his enslaved wife and children. And Hagar Wright, an African-American woman, lost her husband, William, under unusual circumstances and sued for her freedom, and I'll tell you what happened there. And there are little-known stories about 17th century Scots and Irish who were in servitude against their will, and what they did to resist. I'll tell you a bit about them before I finish the talk this evening. So, for a little background, slaves were present in New England from the very earliest days in the 1600s. Samuel Maverick, probably the first Englishman to settle in Massachusetts. He was out on Noddle's Island in Boston Harbor in 1624, and he had African slaves that early. There was a traveler who came to visit him in the 1630s named John Jocelyn, who told of Mr. Maverick's Negro woman, a queen in her own country, according to Jocelyn. And she came to Jocelyn, the visitor, in obvious distress. And she told, well, he found out, I'm not sure how well she could speak English, but he learned at least. As Jocelyn, the writer, put it, Maverick was desirous to have a breed of Negroes. But this queen from her own country refused to mate with the other slave. And so Maverick ordered the male slave to rape her. And we don't know their names or what happened to them, but we do know this about them. And Native Americans were enslaved too. They're like a man named Chaucer of Block Island. He was, the court record said that, and I'm not sure what the circumstances were, but that he was to be sent to the island and kept there as a slave for life. This is very unusual to find in the records, by the way, the word slave, and I'll talk about that a bit more later. Almost always you see the word servant, but that didn't mean that they were free people. Most of the Native Americans who were sold into servitude in colonial New England were war captives or refugees. There was the Pequot War of 1637, and then later on from King Philip's War of 1675, 1676, wars that most people don't know too much about here in New England, but they're starting to get more attention by historians. The first governor of Massachusetts, Governor Winthrop, had a Narragansett Indian, apparently a slave, and a couple who worked for him back in the 1630s. And so when Massachusetts enacted its first code of law in 1641, they gave official sanction to what was already customary. They were forbidding man stealing, as they called it, but they allowed slavery for lawful captives taken in just wars, and such strangers as willingly sell themselves or are sold to us, or who shall be judged thereto by authority. Just to read that, I mean, that's pretty comprehensive there. And this was consistent, that language was consistent even with white slavery, which was not uncommon in the 17th century. It was not simply a matter of color. English were frequently captured by pirates, sold into slavery in the Muslim world and North Africa, for example. And there were a few Englishmen in the colonies in New England who were sold into slavery for crimes, like this man, William Andros, who assaulted his master. William Andros was probably an indentured servant, but and conspiring against the peace. I'm not quite sure what he did, but he was whipped and delivered up a slave. And again, that's one of the rare instances of the word slave that appears in the old records. Soldiers captured in war in those days in the 17th century could also expect, it wouldn't be unlikely that they could be sold off as slaves. And that happened to hundreds, thousands of Scottish war prisoners during the English Civil War. Hundreds of them, well, thousands were captured, and they were forced marched. They were over in England when they were captured, and in Scotland, and they were forced marched to London, and were shipped off to New England for sale against their will to the English colonists. And there were hundreds who came in 2 shiploads. I've done a lot of research about them. They came over in 1651 and 1652, and some were very young, 14, 15 years old, and others had families, wives, children, and there's no sign that most of them ever got to go home again. Similarly, and it's not very well known either, Irish men, women, and children were kidnapped on the streets in Ireland, even from their beds. And this was on orders of Oliver Cromwell back during, and they were sent to, often bondage to the American colonies, New England and Barbados and a variety of places. It was part of an ethnic cleansing of Ireland that not too many people know about, and to open lands for the English to colonize there in Ireland. But early northern slavery is starting to get more attention from scholars, and who are starting to see that it's different from the kind of slavery most of us think about in the South. For example, there's a recent book, 10 Hills Farm, The Forgotten History of Slavery in the North, that does tell about some of these slaves, particularly in the Medford area of Massachusetts. Although this book doesn't use court records very much, but there are a lot of other places where she found some material. But this focuses on slaves, especially who had been owned by Isaac Royal, who moved here from Antigua in the 1730s, and he brought 27 slaves. It was almost certainly the largest group of slaves that anybody owned in New England at the time. A slave quarters was built for them, and it still stands today. It's a museum in Medford, the Isaac Royal House. And it's the only such surviving slave quarters from that time period in the North. So it's well worth a visit if you haven't been there. But Royal's situation was unusual. Recent historical scholarship is starting to show that slavery in the North was a good deal different than it was in the South. New England never developed the plantation-style slavery that people found so much in the South, and didn't even house slaves necessarily in separate quarters. Isaac Royal was an exception. And even the terms used back then, as I started to allude to, caused confusion. Slaves, servants, slippery terms, often blurred, especially in the 1600s and especially in the time period before King Philip's War. As I mentioned, the word slave was just very rarely used back in those days. A servant was the all-purpose term, and that covered everything, a whole range of situations, from people captured and sold to masters against their will, like the Scots, the Indians, a lot of people, the Africans, and they were often sold to masters with no paperwork, no definite terms. I think it was the exception when they really came up with a contract, even in those kinds of situations, and even with indentured servants, although they more often had contracts, but not necessarily. So the terms were very flexible. Some people managed to get freed sooner. There were lifetime slaves, but it was quite a vague thing back then, it seems. So the word servant was almost always used. And slavery was not necessarily a matter of skin color. Now, as I mentioned, and in fact, there was a law in 1652. It was shortly after those Scots were brought over here as war prisoners. And the Massachusetts General Court, that was also the term for the legislature, they passed a law telling the colonists who had these servants that they were to bring the Scotchmen, Negroes, and Indians to practice with them during the militia drills. They were that law was repealed not too long after that. I think they realized that probably wasn't a terribly good idea to arm the slaves and servants, and so that they stopped that. And as I said, slavery was not necessarily for life back then either. The people like the Scots and Irish usually expected to become free after a few years, but it was not uncommon for enslaved Africans and Native Americans to receive their freedom too, to negotiate it, to buy their freedom a variety of ways, especially before that 1675-76 period, King Philip's War. And the conditions of slavery were far more intimate in the North. The slaves living with families right in their own homes, eating at the same tables often, and not surprisingly, other intimacies occurred, and that has been documented in the court records too. So the court records tell a lot of interesting and surprising stories. I don't have time for very many tonight, but I'll tell you a few. And in my book, The Naked Quaker, I tell about Sylvanas Warro. He was an African American. He was owned by a very prominent Puritan who was did a lot of things. He was on the general court, the legislature. He was a judge. He was a military leader, and very interested in education of Native Americans, conversion of them to Christianity. But he owned Sylvanas Warro and Sylvanas's brother named Daniel. And they were born, as I said, in the 1640s in Maryland, and they grew up in the Gookin household. They came as children to Cambridge near Harvard. This is a drawing of how Cambridge looked back in those days. It was still basically a village, and in the foreground there are the Harvard buildings. Gookin was very involved with Harvard. And he, in court records, admitted to what he called natural affection for these boys. It's very likely, although nobody will ever prove it, I think that they may have been his sons. But in any case, he promised that he would eventually set them free. But first, he sent Sylvanas off to Roxbury to work for a friend of his, Deacon William Park. And there, Sylvanas, that didn't work out very well. Sylvanas tried to run away, and he was found and brought back. In fact, I just very recently ran across another piece of the court file that wasn't at the Massachusetts archives that the Mass Historical Society has. So another little piece of the puzzle. I keep finding these in surprising places. Sylvanas evidently fell in love with an English woman who was a servant at Park's household, and she became pregnant. They had a child together. They named him Sylvanas Warro Jr. They seemed they wanted or had hoped to raise him together. And they apparently tried to flee. Sylvanas stole some money, a fairly large sum, but he was caught, arrested, brought back, jailed, whipped, 20 stripes on his bare back, according to the court records, which would have left him scarred for life. wouldn't have killed him. And he was ordered to be sold. And this is where there was some confusion. I think the judges did not realize that he was a slave already. I think they thought that he was a free indentured servant, perhaps. I suspect he was not, his skin color wasn't extremely dark. And they just assumed that he was a free man, but perhaps indentured. Gookin did not tell the court that he owned him. Gookin later admitted, and Park didn't clarify this for the court either, the guy who was sort of renting Sylvanas. And Gookin was angry and said he wanted to teach Sylvanas a lesson, and allowed him to be sold to a slave owner in Medford, a man named Jonathan Wade. And Gookin had a jailhouse meeting with Sylvanas. This has been recorded in the court records. But he encouraged Sylvanas. He said, well, otherwise they'd sell him off to Virginia, which would be even worse. And told him that, you know, I think the interracial relationship really offended Gookin, even though probably he had had one himself. But he told Sylvanas that he should fall in with the Negro wench, as he put it, of Wade's, and live well and try to, you know, move on with his life. Well, Elizabeth the servant who had the child with Sylvanas tried to keep her child. She went off to, her father, in fact, wanted to keep the child, but the court ordered that the child be sold too. They ordered that to dispose of and put out to service the child till he be 30 years of age. And whether Sylvanas and Elizabeth ever saw each other again is just not known. I haven't been able to find that out. But court records show that Sylvanas, although he remained in slavery at the Jonathan Wade's house in Medford, he managed to sneak away a few times. He came back to attend some parties in Cambridge. And this is, it's the court records, Sylvanas Negro, and it tells about how he went to a party, his brother was there, and it was people from all levels of the social hierarchy. The Warro brothers, I think, were well known in Cambridge and had a lot of friends. There were Harvard students there, there were, you know, just all kinds of people. But in any case, the partygoers were all arrested and charged with crimes like dissolute behavior and night walking, and Sylvanas was sent back to his Medford master. Anyway, Daniel Gookin later regretted what he had done, because I think he maybe hoped or thought that this would be a temporary thing, since he had only rented this Sylvanas to Deacon Park, but Jonathan Wade, as far as he was concerned, he had bought this slave for life and was planning to breed him with his other slaves. And anyway, Sylvanas almost won his freedom. And I tell more about what happened in my Naked Quaker book, and I won't go on more about this now. But one thing I did run across in the court records that's not in my book, I don't believe, that I thought was surprising and kind of poignant. Sylvanas's brother Daniel, who was still at that point living in the Gookin household, he offered to trade places with his brother there in Medford, to let his brother come back to be free, to, or at least free enough to live in Cambridge, maybe to see his son and Elizabeth again. He was interested in this African-American woman that Sylvanas wasn't interested in, but Jonathan Wade would not make the trade. Now, many years later, the son, Sylvanas Warro Jr., showed up in Medford at this house. This is still standing. This was Jonathan Wade's house, and it's on Bradley Road, if you know Medford. And he had been, the records indicate that Sylvanas had been in servitude for about 30 years in Rhode Island. and the court records describe him as a mulatto cripple. And we don't know how he became crippled. He was too late to see his father by the time he showed up at the door there. Sylvanas Sr. had died. But Sylvanas Jr. discovered that he had a half-sister in servitude in the Wade household. We never learned her name. She was described only as Madam Wade's mulatto maid. And she was the daughter of Sylvanas Sr. and another English servant that he had apparently had a relationship with while he was there, a woman named Catherine Gross. We don't know too much about Catherine, but she was still in the area, though no longer a servant for the Wades by the time Sylvanas Jr. came there. And Sylvanas Jr. developed a devoted relationship to this half-sister he discovered he had, and he vowed that he would get her free. And he tried repeatedly. Once he fled with her to Charlestown, not too far away from Medford there, and he got friends to witness some papers that he had made. Apparently he could write. And they said that this half-sister was indentured to him. He had training as a tailor. And he got the friends to loan him a horse, and he and his sister started to ride off to freedom, but they were caught. And another time, Sylvanas got the mother, Catherine Gross, to help get the sister out of the house, because by that point the Wades didn't want Sylvanas anywhere near the house. They expected he would help his sister escape, but the mother managed to sneak her out. And they tried a different escape route. Sylvanas, his sister, and the sister's mother, they went west and got as far as Concord. But they were pursued by a constable from Medford named Richard Rooks. And I found in the court records the constable's testimony. Richard Rooks, he complained that he was assaulted by Sylvanas. Sylvanas tried to protect his sister and delay capture as long as possible. And he had a crutch. He used his crutch as a weapon and beat Rooks over the head with it. In fact, it says that, let's see if I, let's see. His crutch, he gave me such a blow upon my head, and blood immediately flowed out, and he said he was giving this testimony just right after it happened. However, Sylvanas' sister and the sister's mother were captured. She went back to servitude. Sylvanas Jr. ended up in jail, and with enormous fines that he was ordered to pay, or he would be sold. And I haven't found records that indicate what happened to him, so I don't know. I hope to find some more about him later. Now, some African Americans in early New England used colonial law to their advantage, as these next cases demonstrate, and Pompey and Anne, his wife, of Milton, are a good example. Now, you may be surprised to read the opening lines of this petition. It was from February 1747. Well, it's to His Excellency William Shirley, Governor, and then the General Court, which was the legislature and the highest court of appeals in those days. And this was the petition of Seth Sumner of Milton, yeoman, farmer, middle-class guy, attorney to Pompey Negro, and who was a servant, according to this, to John Lawhead of Milton, a nailer, and Pompey's wife, Anne. And Seth probably wrote this for Pompey, or someone even wrote it for Seth, perhaps. But it starts out, it says, humbly sheweth. Most of these court records back then were filled with groveling language, because the General Court and the governor really did not like people to question government authority very much, and so petitioners were not, this took a lot of courage, even for Englishmen to petition the government. So, but in this case, Pompey probably could not have walked in there himself, but he got Seth, a Milton man, to do this for him, and so I don't know what their relationship was. But Anne, this says that Anne, the wife of Pompey, was the daughter and only child of a man named Jesse Covet, an Indian. And this was an Indian who, according to this, who went to soldier in the expedition to Cape Breton. This was during one of the French and Indian Wars, and he was fighting on the English colonist side. But Jesse died before he could be paid, and according to the petition, there was a very large sum of money owing to him, 53 pounds, which was an enormous sum in those days. Probably would have been enough to buy Pompey's freedom, and they asked to have it paid to them. And this indicates that Pompey had tried previously to get this money released, but the Committee of War refused, and they said Jesse's estate, the Native American, that his estate hadn't been probated, so they couldn't release it yet, and they said that, well, anyway, the muster rolls and all the records had been lost in a fire, so there was no proof. Well, more records here. There are several days, there are three pieces of paper over a period of several days, so it's clear that Seth came to Boston. Perhaps Pompey and Anne did too, but most likely they had to stay back in Milton. And Seth humbly prays. He asks them to direct, he asks the governor to direct the Committee of War to release those funds. And he pointed out that it was unnecessary to have the Indian's estate probated. It would be unusual, he said, for an Indian to have his estate probated, because he didn't own anything. All he owned was this money that was owed to him as a soldier. And a few days later, they were successful. And this is hard to read. It's pretty light, but they directed the Committee of War to release money, but not the 50-some pounds. It was a good deal less, 15 pounds and 11 pence. But still a substantial sum. And now much later, when this was summarized in the official legislative records, I found the published and typed up version. This referred to Pompey as a free Negro. Now, I didn't see any indication of that in the records that I found. There may well have been more records, but I think it's probably more likely that whoever summarized these records for publication later just assumed that he must have been free. It's a servant, after all, and he had an attorney, for goodness sakes. But I think he was most likely a slave. And intriguingly, I found in about 20 years later, John Newton, his will in Milton left to my Negro Pompey, gave him lifetime use of his house and 6 acres of land, which was a pretty unusual bequest, and also left him my everyday wearing clothes, threw that in too. So I don't know if this was the same Pompey. If he was not free before then, he evidently was free later. There were other mentions of him in land records and so forth that suggested he became free. So more research is needed. I don't know what happened to him, and I don't know what happened to Anne. So I hope someone will take up the research and find out. We know a lot more, however, about a free black farmer from the New London, Connecticut area, John Jackson, and his family, because the court records reveal how he made a dramatic rescue effort to save his wife and children in the 1700s. Now, he and his wife, Joan, had once been slaves of the Rogers family of New London, and they were wealthy New Londoners, kind of eccentric, who started their own religion called the Rogerines. And it was similar to the Puritans. I had a nasty letter to me recently. So I wrote about this story, this case, and someone who thought that I was not sufficiently respectful of the Rogerines. I mean, there was a lot. I had to compress this into an article, a short article, so I had a lot of respect for the Rogerines, but they were eccentric. I mean, there was just no way around that. But they were influenced by Quakers and Baptists. And anyway, most of the Rogers family freed their slaves, which was a very good thing, including John and Joan. But a probate dispute arose after the death of the patriarch James Rogers, and it led one of the heirs to claim Joan and her children as belonging to them. And Joan and the children were seized from their home, where they had lived for many years as a quiet farming couple in the New London area, and they were taken off to Long Island and enslaved there again. Now, John Jackson, the husband, and one of the Rogers men, John Rogers, who was almost certainly Joan's father or brother, and apparently DNA studies are being done too. So, but the court records described her as a mulatto, so she clearly was not all African. And John Jackson and John Rogers rescued Joan and a couple of the children in the middle of the night, took her on a boat. They spirited her off to Rhode Island into temporary hiding, and but they were captured again, and John Jackson and John Rogers were arrested. And they testified in court. It was a very unusual question and answer format. I hardly ever find this in records of that time period, where they show you know, the question, answer. And John refused. He was a savvy guy, this John Jackson, and he refused to admit anything. It was kind of like, you know, you have when people are accused of crimes, they don't have to testify against themselves even today. And he said, I don't know if I can quickly find it here, but, well, I can't find it quickly, but he said, you must prove it. You must prove the charges against me. Anyway, John wouldn't give up. Not long after this, his wife Joan and their youngest child, an infant, were sold in Massachusetts, and John Jackson followed. He filed a lawsuit in Middlesex County Superior Court in 1717, and this was probably written, well, definitely written for him, I think, by someone, by the clerk. But it starts out that they want to let the king, they want the king to know, to be informed that Joan is a free woman. And it goes on to tell about John Jackson told the story, and they brought a lot of evidence in, testimony from people in Connecticut explaining what had happened. And John Jackson signed with a mark, which I thought was really poignant. It's John Jackson for himself and his wife Joan, but his mark, there were two circles close together for himself and his wife. Anyway, the jury came back with a verdict, and they said, we find for the plaintiffs that his wife Joan to be a free woman. And finally, after all these years, they had success. They went back to New London, back to their farmhouse, and they lived there for the rest of their lives. However, some of the children were never able to escape from slavery, despite John Jackson's continued efforts in the courts. And there's a lot more about them, but it was a story that I think really it deserves, I don't know, movie treatment or something, I think. Now, about the same time, another former Rogers slave got caught up in these probate disputes too. Hagar Wright, it's somebody probably wrote this for her, though, you know, we don't know. She maybe could write, but it says, signed Hagar. And she sued for her freedom, and in one of the papers, and I can't find it quickly here, she referred to herself as a poor, despised widow woman. Now, she had been married to William Wright. She was an African American, and it's not clear whether she was actually a widow at the time of this lawsuit, because she lost her husband under unusual circumstances. He was a Native American, William Wright, and he became a member of this Rogerine sect. And he got in trouble for working on the Sabbath. Rogerines did that. And he ended up banished from the colony of Connecticut after he stood up in court and he told the judges that he was going to continue to work on the Sabbath. John Rogers said the same thing to the court. They didn't banish him, but they banished William Wright. Now, it was a work issue of a different sort that I want to mention. I want to tell a little bit of, bring us back to Massachusetts for a minute. It brought two Irish young men to the attention of the Massachusetts courts. And just for some background, in 1654, a judge from Ipswich named Samuel Simons bought two Irish boys off of a ship that had come into the Boston Harbor by Captain George Dell, the ship Goodfellow. And Simons bought a child of the age of 11, Philip Welch, and an older youth named William Downing. Paid a lump sum of a little over 26 pounds for them, and Captain Dell penned an official-looking bill of sale, saying that Philip would have to serve for 11 years servitude and 9 years for William. And the bill of sale that the captain penned said that this was by the order of the state of England. And, well, Simons took the boys home to his house in Ipswich, which used to belong to the son of the first governor of Massachusetts. And the boys spoke little or no English at first. And one of them, William, had some kind of a skin condition that was disfiguring. Simons referred to him as looking roughy or hazardous. And a doctor took one look at William, pronounced leprosy, but turned out it evidently wasn't that. Anyway, the boys labored there without pay until one night, almost 7 years to the day from when they were taken to Ipswich, they staged a rebellion. And this is the testimony's all there in the court records. The family was all gathered one evening. There were servants, there were a few visitors, guests too, and they were getting ready to do their Bible reading after dinner, as they normally did. And before the prayers, Philip raised the subject of the next day's plowing, and he announced that we will work for you no longer. Well, shocked, Simons asked, what are you going to do, play? He did give this testimony in court. Anyway, Philip said, we've served you for 7 years, and we think that's long enough. You know, if you'll pay us like ordinary men, we'll continue to work for you, to plant your corn, mend your fences, but otherwise, we won't work anymore. Well, Simons was just outraged. He had the Irish boys arrested, jailed, they were brought to court, and there was a panel of 4 judges, one of whom was Simons himself, so you can imagine the chances they had. But there was a jury as well, and Philip and William testified about how they had been kidnapped from Ireland. They had been pulled out of their beds, literally, and they were taken to this ship, the Goodfellow, and there they found other Irish men and boys who were weeping, grieving, who had also been kidnapped, and nobody consented to be shipped across the Atlantic. They didn't ask to be indentured servants or consent to it, but they said they had given Simons their best efforts for 7 years, and now they wanted to be free. And the jury clearly was sympathetic. They said yes, they should be freed unless, and the caveat was, unless this was a legal document that put them into servitude for all those years. Well, that was a legal question that the jury wasn't allowed to decide. That went to the 4 panel judges, including Simons, who pointed out to the other judges that, well, you know, this could just create havoc all over New England, because these weren't the only boys who were in this situation. So no surprise, the court ordered the Irish to serve out their terms. And I tell more what happened in my Naked Quaker book. Now, some of the Scottish slaves, servants, you know, servants against their will, resisted servitude too. And I'll just tell you about a few of them. For example, at a sawmill in Maine, 1654, relations turned violent between Alexander Maxwell, one of these Scots who had been captured in the English Civil War, and his master, George Leader, there was severe punishment, 30 lashes, and the court ordered that for his exorbitant and abusive carriages towards his master and mistresses, as they put him, he would, if he misbehaved again, he would be sold out of the colony to Virginia, Barbados, or one of the other English plantations, they said. And he ended up not being sold. I've met a lot of his descendants. He settled later in Maine, became free later on. But that same year, 1654, in Massachusetts, others lashed out against their masters too, other Scots. There was a Scotsman named Daniel Black in Charlestown who assaulted and beat up his master, Wilton Symes. And Daniel McKenna of Cambridge got whipping and extra service for stubborn carriage. We don't know exactly what he did, against Mercy Brigham, who owned him. And a Scotsman in Sudbury named James Ross he was sentenced to the most extreme corporal punishment short of death that I've found in the court records, 39 lashes, which was nearly a killing punishment. But he did survive. I've met a lot of his descendants, and he was a tough person, and had an interesting story, and I tell more about him and one of his sons in my book. Some Scots went to court too, asking for their freedom. The Massachusetts General Court in 1655 rejected a petition by several Scotsmen. I've never been able to find their names, but said that the court said they saw no reason to let them be freed. And another man named John Ross in Plymouth petitioned the General Court there similarly, after he had worked 6 years for nothing, he said, for Nathaniel Warren. But the court said that he needed to serve at least another year before they let him go. Now, I did want to end with what I thought was one of the more ironic cases that I ran across in the records, because ironically, some of these Scottish war prisoners who were enslaved, at least for a period of years against their will, became slave owners themselves later on. John Roy, for example, he started out as a soap boiler in Charlestown, according to the records. He rose very quickly up the social ladder, married probably his master's daughter, and ended up being a relative of some of the really prominent people in Massachusetts. He became a mariner, a slave owner, and nearly died at the hands of his slave. One winter day in the 1670s at the docks in Boston, his slave, only identified in the records as Nicholas Negro, aimed a loaded pistol at John Roy. And apparently, somebody had a knife. They struggled. John Roy ended up bleeding from knife wounds, but he survived. And Nicholas was sentenced, more whippings, that people got whipped a lot back then, 29 stripes. And he was ordered to be sold out of the colony to, presumably, somewhere south. Now, I've only highlighted a few of the stories that I found about slavery and servitude in the old court records. I'm convinced there's lots more out there untouched by scholars, unfound so far. I've run across all kinds of bits and pieces that I would love to spend more time on. So, and I think ultimately, when these have been researched more by scholars, it'll give us a much richer, more nuanced picture of what early New England slavery was all about. So if you want to do some court records research yourself, because I think these are it's the best source that I know of to bring history to life. I brought my books tonight. I have my New England Court Records book, and as well as, which is a reference book that tells how to find and use court records from the 17th to the 21st centuries. And then my book, The Naked Quaker, True Crimes and Controversies from the Courts of Colonial New England, has more stories, more detail about some of the things I talked about tonight, but a lot of other stories about all kinds of people from around New England. If you want to know what I'm up to, I do have a couple of websites. My author-speaker website is dianerapaport.com, and I have a list of my publications there. I was going to put together a list for you of some of the things I've written about slavery, because I have written some articles in New England Ancestors Magazine, now American Ancestors Magazine, the New England Historic Genealogical Society's journal. And I've written a lot about those Scots who came over here as well. And I do consulting research for people these days, historical and genealogical. The most exciting research that I've done recently, I can't resist telling you, I was hired by the BBC London as a research consultant for the British version of the show Who Do You Think You Are, if any of you have seen that. It probably won't get filmed here, but it won't be shown here. I got filmed, though, very recently at the Massachusetts Archives, because I found some records about a British celebrity who must remain unnamed at the moment, but I got to meet him and tell him about his early New England ancestors. So anyway, there's just a lot of interesting stuff out there to be found, and lots more about slavery, and I hope some of you take up the task of finding out more. So I'd be happy to answer questions if anyone has any, but you've been a great audience. Thanks so much for coming out in this weather.
Some research, local history, specifically about Thomas Hutchinson. I wonder if you could tell me, was Hutchinson a slave owner? I know I've seen references to his servants, his servant, and I've seen diagrams of his property on Old Hill where he had an extensive garden with either servants' quarters or slave quarters. Have you ever run into that? Do you know anything more about that?
Researched him specifically, but I think it's certainly very likely that, you know, almost everybody of prominence back then had, well, not everyone, but lots of people had slaves, more than you might think. You know, people often had one slave, but somebody as prominent as that probably did. And if the records say servants, as I said, that doesn't mean that they weren't slaves, because they were almost always referred to as servants back then. But that would be interesting to look into more, but I don't specifically know.